I'm going to start by an apology. I have to be absent for May 21st online reading with Barbara Unger, who's a wonderful, wonderful poet. And I had a medical emergency. Basically, I had a sudden attack of vertigo, and thank you very much for your patience, Barbara, and also Ashland Poetry Press staff, Deborah and Jen and Paige. Thank you so much for your patience. And more than a month later, I'm recording my reading of poems from my book, The Museum of Small Bones. I'm really grateful for Katsumoto Mitsuru. Mitsuru Katsumoto, she's a Japanese artist who let me use the image of her work for my cover. And she's been really one of my favorite artists since I was young. The first poem is called Rapture. And when I was in junior high, I was obsessed with cooking, frying marbles in a pan. And after they get very hot, you can put them in ice water, and then they kind of crackled. They get cracked, and these patterns that the cracking makes is really quite beautiful. It's basically a damage that's being contained, but it would look something like this. I hope you can see it. Around this time was when I started learning English, and I just hated it, and I was so bad at it. And I think I don't think I know I was a student who scored the lowest in the first English exam. So there you go. Rapture. There were nights I just had to cook marbles. I knew Mother would hit me when she discovered her wrecked pan the next morning. We had no special oil for frying glass, and cooking only with dry heat did much harm to the pan's surface. It was the year I began learning English in school. The word harm never appeared in any of my textbooks. All the same, I would reach for a jar of marbles on the spice shelf, the cheapest kind for children. Each marble held a primary colored flame at its core, vivid as a pupil. I heaped them on my palm, listening to them squeak as they rubbed together. No one taught us how to love foreign words, nor the logic behind their syntax. Soon, marbles would start their rattle and roll in the pan. In the workshop below, Father was building a crystal radio on the cusp of two Japanese eras. The emperor he had once believed was divine was dying, said the news. No longer a god, but a symbol emptying itself. Blindly, I kept cooking in the midnight kitchen. The moment the heated orbs grew ready to pop, I transferred them to a bowl of ice water. The sizzle, the crackle inside each glass sphere. Fisher's silver scars radiated, nebulous damage contained within clear little bowls. This poem is called Through the Willows, and there's the daikon that shows up in my poem. Daikon is, of course, a vegetable. It's a type of radish, but in Japanese, it's used to describe someone's fat legs, and sometimes very bad actors are called daikon. I don't know why. And also, in my days in Japan, junior high or high school, it was almost like a ritual. Graduation day, a girl would ask a boy she likes if she can get his school uniform button. Usually it's the second one from the top. But if the boy is popular, he'll probably lose all his buttons on his jacket. So those two things. Through the willows. Bless the cherry that must still bloom in April, its trunk scarred with initials, hasty students' hands. Bless the tadpoles that fatten in rice paddies, keep their bodies plump like gray marbles. Restore to me and my best friend her lipsticks, my comic books, confiscated at the school gate. Bless our daikon thighs, pale and plump, our meaty calves in thick high socks. How our empty bento boxes sang on the way home at dusk. Everyone's secret stop, the local 7-Eleven. Pork buns, curry buns, pizza buns, sweet bean buns. Forgive our confusion on spiritual matters, horoscopes, Ouija boards, funerals for insects. Have mercy on the whereabouts of our ancestors. We've committed to memory the Lord's Prayer in 5 and 7 syllables. Do not hold me accountable for those Chinese characters I made up for pop quizzes. Redeem our first sex education, a shadowgraph of the cutout we couldn't tell where her body started and his body ended. The number of hours we spent guessing each other's crush. I don't really have one. Bless my crush and his ugly uniform, one of its golden buttons closest to his heart. Bless the city we kept dreaming of leaving, yet neither of us can return now. Bless the willows that line the road, swaying. And who was I then? When he and I passed each other in rain. This is called Late August Song. Late August Song. Like quicksilver, cicadas' voices well up from behind us, sister. And summer has hollowed itself to a shell to contain our fears clearly. In the village of our childhood sea, it's the night of the Lantern Festival you and I will not attend. Remember joining a procession, their bon dance years ago? Even as we merged with the fish-smelling crowd, each flushed face seemed ever so beyond us, between light and dark. Where were they headed in their almost knowing steps? Tonight is a festival of the dead, sister. Open your palm. Our pocket-sized father stands on the lines of your hand, holding a sparkler like summer itself. Magnesium reigns in white flames, these relentless, fleeting seconds as we turn away from each other. My absent sister, cicadas' songs rise liquid silver from behind us to claim this season. Now separate, are we strong enough to sing against the ringing of something ever-splitting? Something more than indifference? I'm going to read sections from my lyric essay called Production of Silk. It started out with my memory of raising silkworms, and then finding out the cocoon motifs. The silk cocoon was a motif for classical Japanese poetry, and I did some scientific research as well, kind of trying to think about the mystery of how silk comes into being through these worms. And then it became a meditation of the production of art and also the process of writing itself. Production of silk. 1. Heavenly worm. Mrs. Ito, our 4th grade teacher, drew a new kanji character on the board. Kaiko. This one. Worm from heaven, she announced. As you can see, heaven splits open like a curtain, and inside it dwells the worm. For each student, she took out 5 worms from her basket and put them in a small paper box to take home. Having just hatched from their eggs, these worms are still covered in little black hairs. That's why at this stage they're called kego, hairy baby. To feed these dark babies, you must first julienne your mulberry leaves. 2. Cowboys. 1. They were like cowboys, someone said afterward, the 2 white American poets visiting our month-long workshop in Europe. Many of us, including me, admired their poetry. Wasn't it worth traveling to the continent if we got the chance to see such stars on their summer vacation gig? Mr. P, a prominent poet in his own right, led the workshop, and I was his wild card. For their particular visit, He casually chose my poem that had silkworms, mulberry leaves, and the image of a mother inside a cocoon like a chrysalis. "I don't believe this," Cowboy X said of my cocooned mother imagery. Like a patient father, Mr. P tried to ease the tension by turning the visitor's aversion into advice. "What changes would you suggest to make it real?" "As I said, this isn't a poem," X growled. "I just don't believe any of it for a second." "I don't mind the image of mulberries, though. I used to eat them," Cowboy Y said, grinning like a kid under his wide-brimmed hat. "They're rather tasty." 4. Platinum Boy, 2006. After decades of research, Japanese silkworm breeders discovered a reliable method of hatching exclusively male silkworms. Female silkworms eat more, sleep more, take up more space, and are measurably less efficient in transforming mulberry leaves into silk. The verdict was clear. Female silkworms are inferior for silk production. Silk spinners and kimono weavers are unanimous in their praise of male silk. Their thread is consistently finer, sturdier, glossier, whiter, and their cocoons are easier to harvest when boiled. The birth site of Platinum Boy is literally black and white. When you look at a piece of paper where silkworm eggs are laid, white eggs are the empty shells from which male larvae have already hatched. They will thrive on the diet of tender mulberry shoots, which, combined with their spit, will eventually turn into raw silk, translucent like frosted glass. The darker eggs contain female larvae that will never hatch and only keep darkening. 7. 10,000 Leaves 1. Compiled in the mid-8th century, Manyoshu, collection of 10,000 Leaves, is the oldest poetry anthology of Japan. More than 4,500 poems in 20 books. In the sweltering heat of the attic, I wasn't looking for any particular motif when I happened on poem number 2495, composed by Kakinomoto no Hitomaro, a low-rank courtier and one of the saints of Japanese poetry. Like my mother's silkworms locked inside cocoons, how can I see my love who lives secluded at home? Poem number 2991 is an almost identical poem by an unknown poet. Like my mother's silkworms locked inside cocoons, sadness clouds my heart when I cannot see her. The motif of a silk cocoon as the inaccessible, lyrical interior goes back to the dawn of Japanese poetics. The cocoon encases the image of the beloved, the poet's longing that keeps building inside, and in my poem, it holds the mother as a mythical seamstress stitching blue in each wrist of her unborn daughter. 11. Shokunin 1. My father would describe his mother as fierce and obsessive. She was a destructive visionary and unsuccessful business entrepreneur during the critical times of the Second World War. Whenever I felt defeated by my own restlessness, I would blame it on the woman I had never met in person, only in a fading picture where she stands next to my father in school uniform. Without glasses, his eyes appear surprisingly gentle. My father told me during one of his late-night international calls from Tokyo, "Your grandfathers were both shokunin," which means craftsman. Remember? It's in your DNA, too. His father came from a large family of silk farmers. After he left home, adopting the newly introduced Singer sewing machines, he began manufacturing Japanese cloven-toed socks, the traditional kind that used to be hand-sewn. During the war, he took the assignment to sew parachutes for the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. While he worked under dimmed light, my young father hung up his primitive drawing of warplanes on the wall, feeling fine grains of sand underneath. 12. 10,000 Leaves 2. Poem number 1357 of the Manyoshu invokes the mystery of silk production. If prayer can turn the mulberry trees from my mother's garden into silk kimono, why don't I pray for my love to be felt in return? The earliest Japanese poets attached power to longing. I hold on to this fact when tempted to approach life with an ironic distance. If your intense desire can move the gods to transform mulberry leaves into silk, then surely your difficult love has the chance of being requited. After all, the creation of silk is nothing short of magical. No pearl extract, but warm spit transforms leaves into a thread, a precise mixture of proteins that hardens into a fiber once exposed to air. Like a prism, each fiber is triangular in shape, refracting light. Even if the gem string called life gets cut short, I would rather be born a silkworm than a human being. My American friends were shocked by the blunt pessimism of poem number 3086. I confess that I find myself wishing the same for brief moments when I'm in a particularly hostile writing workshop, or more generally, when the gap between language and life seems to have grown to the point where the very act of translation feels gratuitous. 14. Shokunin 2. My grandfather on my mother's side was also a skilled craftsman who made anything with wood: chairs, rice tubs, wash basins, traditional bathtubs, perfect cubes for camera obscurers on special commission from the Konishiroku company. During his courting days, when my father came to visit my mother, my grandfather would ignore his presence completely by occupying his hands. Only after the clock struck 5 in the evening would he put away his tools, turn to my father as if noticing for the first time, and welcome him with a thin but not unfriendly smile. Your mother's father was a true shokunin, my father said. From his back, I understood something about the virtue of craftsmanship. Of all the ways I reassure myself, I'm most comforted to remember that I come from the families of shokunin. I never believed that the self is a project of one's own making, and having a specific role assigned to me is, paradoxically, a form of freedom. From day to day, far from the sublime, what saves me is not magical encounters or words of charisma, but small works I'm equipped to do, tasks that require faithful use of my hands, shaping things for someone beyond my immediate reality. 18. Cocoonery. They climb onto straw holders divided into hundreds of rooms. Each silkworm sits in its own cell in the cocoonery. It throws a wispy web to anchor itself and starts tossing its head in a figure 8 with single devotion. Once emitted in the air, the clear liquid solidifies into a shimmering fiber. This is the only way silk comes into being in the world. Mulberry leaves become such prismatic threads through the steady digestion of the stubby worms. If premature worms happen to climb onto the cocoon holders by mistake, their urine and feces could spoil the cocoons spun by their fully mature neighbors. In some cases, premature worms are so sluggish in settling in their cells that they use up all their strength before completing their task. Their cocoons remain gauze thin, barely hiding the lifeless bodies of their makers. 29. Unraveling. As soon as our assigned worms enveloped themselves in thick ovals of silk, we had to bring them to school. Their metamorphosis into moth takes about 10 days. You must harvest silk before they emerge, Mrs. Ito said, before their hard, wet eyes break open their cocoons and ruin the fine threads. Like an offering, each student deposited their cocoons in the shallow bamboo basket. Once part of the collective heap, none of us could tell which cocoons used to belong to whom. Led by Mrs. Ito, our whole class marched to a nearby farmhouse. The long one-story building stood against the hill with a rocky backyard that stretched all the way to my favorite mulberry tree. While we knelt upright on the sunburned straw mat, the old woman of the house worked quickly, plunging the cocoons into a wooden tub full of warm water. Her dark and wrinkled face was reminiscent of a no mask of an ancient god with rounded eyebrows. She plucked thread ends from half a dozen cocoons and started unraveling. As the white threads continued being pulled out, the cocoons bobbed left and right like miniature souls, gradually turning transparent. My throat tightened. Boiled pupae in their brown shells became exposed. The cocoons kept reeling, and the woman's hand gathered the filaments as fine as smoke, clear like threaded sugar. This is what she had done for the last 50 years. 30. If I were a caterpillar of any kind, somehow blessed or cursed with a mind, I would leave meal pray that I be spared from the fate of dying with unspun thread still inside my body. In the end, silkworms die soon enough, whether or not they have completed their cocoon project. They keep pushing forward, knowingly or unknowingly, spinning out 1,000 yards of lucid strand in no more than 3 days. The rate of their own shroud making is 1 foot per minute. I'm going to just read 2 more poems. This one is called Griddle Through the Wood. This was inspired by 2 poems by Marie Howe, part of Eve's discussion, which is very, very famous, and Griddle from a Sudden Clearing, which is less famous, but I love it so much. So this is my Griddle Through the Wood. It was like getting lost in the wood whose heart you enter one kind of person and emerge quite another. Isn't that what a story is? A beginning, an end, and whatever in between. A clearing where you find yourself one morning. Few crumbs from the dark loaf you shared with Sam the night before. There is no more turning back home. There was no home. It was like falling out of a dream and waking up in another, not trusting your body would cast a shadow. The velvet of the mothman's ears. The berries for snakes gleam just beyond your touch. Leaves are the birds who have sealed their songs in green. Beneath them all, the water couldn't run purer. You call him over and over, the name growing more foreign each time, like a city that belongs to someone else's dream. When you finally stumble into a world out of the wood, your mouth will have tasted earth. Your words won't be understood for what they are. People grow restless when you sing fragments. They'll teach you poetry while bread keeps rising. Here, children become adults so quickly you are the last girl whose shadow pulls on the ground at dusk. When the wind dies, you catch the sound of pollen falling gold between the trees. Even as you sing, in a new way, their way, your song points to him for months and years until one day it doesn't. There are more voices you didn't know you have. Don't be afraid. You are being dreamed by someone outside this world every bloody step of the way in the story. More hearts to enter. Don't be afraid. You are abandoned. You have been dearly loved. This is the last poem called Border. Once in grad school, I made a mistake of taking French and classical Chinese at the same time in one semester, and I nearly had a nervous breakdown. So it's really not recommended. But this vision, I think, in the poem sort of comes from around that time, and also once I was very fortunate to live very close to the glass flower collection that was part of the Harvard Museum of Natural History, so that's in there too. Border. When you look up, the tree is full of birds as if they've grown in clusters overnight, dark fruit made of beaks and feathers. There must be a world beyond such a series of self-projections. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one, said John Ruskin. Underneath the smell of the leaves, merging with dirt, decaying along their margins. Why sing in a tongue not your own, string strangeness into a spell that fuels your fear and keeps you hungry? Voices, copious in the land drained of colors on the cusp of winter. The morning after the flood, this is the closest you've come to the edge of the unreal. The tree standing drenched in rain, a border between here and elsewhere. Neither the mystic's crystal castle nor the gallery of glass flowers next door, but a tree dripping with piercing cries, all mouths, beating leaves. The birds and branches are one, entwined for necessary heat. It's you, waiting to be translated. Thank you very much.